Welcome to Jesus On, a look at today's issues from an eternal perspective. Pastor Zack and Pastor John will be giving us biblical insight into some of the problems the world faces today. Sit back and listen as we hear Jesus On, the problems you're dealing with right now.
Well, welcome to Jesus On. My name is Zack, and this is John next to me. Thanks for listening in. Jesus On is a podcast where we look at the life and the teaching of Jesus and see what he has to say about areas of our life that are relevant. Now, I want to talk about today a topic that maybe actually is not that relevant, but I wonder if it should be. And we're going to talk about Jesus on sabbatical. Jesus on sabbaticals. Okay, Pastor John, why don't you start?
Well, sabbatical is kind of an application of, in a previous podcast, we were talking about the Sabbath, and Jesus talks about the Sabbath, being the Lord of the Sabbath, and Sabbath being created for man, and it's clear that we are designed for rest. And so a sabbatical is kind of an application of that. Mm-hmm. Jesus doesn't talk about that in specific terms, but we felt like it was maybe a helpful, important thing for us to talk about in this regard. There's an archery concept, and that is that if your bow is always strung, that eventually it will break. You have to unstring your bow. You can't always have stress on the bow. It will ruin it. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is true for us. And we need not only a weekly kind of day of rest, but you see in the Old Testament the concept of God took that and he projected that into bigger seasons of rest over periods of time. For example, the farmers in the Old Testament were to sow seeds and work their fields for 6 years, and then they were to have that seventh year where the fields were to be fallow, mm-hmm. where they were not to be planted, where they were to be able to rest. Mm-hmm. And it helps them because the land becomes exhausted. The same crops, sometimes farmers rotate their crops. A farmer will sow different places the same crop so that the land isn't always having the same nutrients pulled out of it by the same crop every time. It's mm-hmm. growing different things in different years. And so in our life, sometimes we need longer stretches of rest and renewal. Mm-hmm. And so you and I both been blessed to have a time where we had like a 3-month sabbatical rest mm-hmm. from our work.
Yeah.
And not everyone gets that. However, as I read in business journals, there is a growing number of businesses and careers where they do offer certain types of sabbatics for people, so they can mm-hmm. have a sabbatical period of rest or specialized training and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so that's kind of the way I'm approaching it. That is this is an application of that Old Testament idea that rather than just the weekly cycle, we also need bigger cycles.
Yeah.
And they even have it beyond just the 6-year cycle in a bigger mm-hmm. sense in the Old Testament.
And where we get the word sabbatical is it is the word that is used in the Old Testament. It was called the sabbatical year, in which they would, give that piece of land rest and trust God would provide mm-hmm. for them with that. So it is a strange idea for some people to think, man, taking a month or 2 months or 3 months off, completely off. And there's a sense in which, well, I can't do that, so I'm just never going to do it, period. And I would encourage people to consider, is there a way in which they can make some of their vacation time more than just a vacation and make it more of a sabbatical? An extended period of time, as long as they can make it where they rest, truly rest, and let their lives kind of follow. It reminds me of a friend. He said this, and I thought this was so spot on. He was talking about how he went on this trip to Hawaii, and it was a 14-day trip, and he said, on the 13th day, he finally felt like he was finally like resting. Like it took 13 days for his body and his mind to just kind of come down, and it just struck me, this idea that we need extended periods of time. Like, we can't be in vacation mode after 1 day or sabbatical mode after 2 days. It's like our body needs to just follow itself. So let's just kind of share a little bit of our own stories. You just got done with a 3-month sabbatical. What was of value? What did you gain from that that might be helpful for us to kind of glean from?
Well, first of all, I certainly identify with what you were just saying, and that's it does take a while to begin to slow down and get out of the rhythm. And of course, email follows you relentlessly, and you have to mitigate against that and provide a way to kind of get away from the things that kind of keep you in the same headspace that you are when you're at work. And so the important thing for me was to have a long enough time away, and it helped that we were able to go away to a different physical location. And that helped too, because ultimately what you're trying to do is get your head space to be in a different place. And that's the real challenge, is to get where you can really let go of the kinds of things that you normally are thinking about, stressing about, working on, and just really be present in a different headspace. And so for me, that was the most helpful thing, is to come to a point where I could experience just not thinking about and being concerned with the kinds of things that normally you're thinking about. And again, the idea is it is an investment. You know, it was an investment in the land in the Old Testament. It's for companies that offer this for employees and types of employees. It is an investment in the productivity of that person in the long term.
Yeah.
And I think so often we just don't think long term about anything anymore in our culture, to our detriment. And I think we have to kind of think about ourselves, investing in ourselves in the long term of life. And so just having the opportunity to be far enough away, long enough to actually get away in your thinking. How about for you, when you experienced your sabbatic, what was the thing that was most impactful or helpful for you?
Well, we planted the church almost exactly 12 years ago, and going hard for 7 years, I was burned out. I was just burned out. And I got this opportunity to go on a 3-month sabbatical. I remember asking certain pastors who'd been on sabbatical, like, hey, give me some advice. And their 2 pieces of advice were this. Well, it was 1 piece of advice and 1 warning. Their 1 warning was, you're going to be angry. And I was like, what? What are you talking about? But I heard it from enough different pastors. I'm like, okay, apparently I need to be prepared to be angry. And then their advice was, whatever you have planned, don't do it. Just don't do anything. So I went into it thinking I was not going to get angry, because I'm a pretty happy person. And I had a plan. I actually had this whole books I was going to read and things I was going to do. And I go into this, and sure enough, about a week in, I could not believe the emotions that I had. And here's what I think what happened. When you go to work, you're distracted because you got things to do. But when you are forced where you're not allowed to do any of your work, I wasn't allowed. Was not allowed to check the email, wasn't allowed to respond to emails. When you get into a place where you are not doing any work, what you are left with is all the failures you've made the past 7 years. That's what I felt like. I just felt like there was no distractions, and what I was left with was just all the things I missed the mark on. And so the first month was actually really, really painful. Lots of tears, lots of struggles, but it ended up being a gift, because I was able to really have to reckon with some of the struggles and just junk in my life that work distracted me from.
Mm-hmm.
The things that were burning me out, I had to deal with. And so it was actually really, really hard
Mm-hmm.
and very, very painful. And finally, by month 2, I was getting to the place where I realized here is what it must look like for me to no longer struggle with this burnout.
Mm-hmm.
It's like I needed 2 months to deal with my junk, if you will, and figure out God's pathway forward on how to live a more healthy life. And if I wouldn't have had those 2 months, I don't know if I would have ever saw it.
Mm-hmm.
Like you said, different place, different space, different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to a different place, had a different pace, and I was able to see things from a completely different point of view. And it was painful and it was life-changing.
Yeah. You commented on a couple of things I wanted to ask about, or comment on one and ask about one. I recently met with someone who is planning a sabbatical this coming year. They're going to take a sabbatical rest. And they had quite a list of things they wanted to do. They wanted to do about 3 years of stuff during that 3-month break, right? And it's easy to kind of expect, oh, I'm going to be able to accomplish so much. And really, the most important thing to accomplish is to be able to have space to, like you were talking about, to unpack those things that are built up inside and rest. And that doesn't mean just rest physically, but to be able to rest emotionally and spiritually. And so I think that was a good thing for you to have a plan, but then to also realize you got to have a little space just to breathe.
And might I point out, I did one thing on my plan, 1 out of the 10.
Yeah, and that probably helped you have a better sabbatical. But you had started the church, you were here about 7 years or so, and when you had that, I would imagine, being a church planter, even at 7 years, you felt maybe the church might need you, that it was vulnerable to walk away and leave things for 3 months. And I know people who maybe are working in a company, and they might, even if their company has a policy for letting people have some kind of sabbatical rest or training, they might feel a little exposed, a little vulnerable. Will the company decide that my job isn't valuable when they see how well they get along with me not being here for 3 months?
Mm-hmm.
And so what helped you to not be anxious about the vulnerability of being gone from an important work at a critical time for 3 whole months?
At just a really practical level, I created a plan. And when I say I created a plan, I had a couple of staff members that really helped me create that plan.
For the church in your absence.
For the church in my absence. I just created a plan. And when our leadership team had complete buy-in on this and just said, we want to support you in this, that was a huge help. So, but it is, sorry, you do have to be humble enough to go, maybe I'm not needed 24/7. And you know what? It was incredible. I came back and some things that were on my plate were no longer on my plate anymore, because it was an opportunity to kind of delegate other responsibilities to maybe some more gifted people.
So in a way, you might say that it's not only good for us to have a break, but for our church or our company, it can be a blessing for them in a sense too, not to no longer value us, but to better understand how to utilize us and have us be productive in more meaningful ways.
Absolutely. Let me ask you this, and maybe we can kind of end here. So not all of us can take 3 months off, but probably most of our audience, they can take a week off, or they can take a couple of weeks off. Maybe some of them have the ability to take 3+ weeks off. And if they did and said, I'm going to try and not just take a vacation, I'm going to take a 2-week-long sabbatical, what would it look like for them?
Oh, you have to answer that because I'm not sure. A 2-week sabbatical is a challenging thing to do because it does take time to just, like you said, to kind of work through your junk and really kind of get past the shadow that you're coming out from under. And I don't have anything against people taking working vacations either. Sometimes people do that, and that can be better than nothing. But really, if you can extend beyond 2 weeks, it's just worth it if you can.
Mm-hmm.
I think if you can get away, I think getting away, I think putting yourself in an opportunity where you can not just be busy with other vacation things, but have an opportunity to reflect and allow things to surface and in a healthy way process them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that can help. I think so often vacations become work in and of themselves if we're not careful, rather than times of rest.
Mm-hmm. I would advise a few things. One, call it a sabbatical. Don't call it a vacation. Start with the mindset of this is going to be a sabbatical. Turn off all the inputs. Don't watch TV. Don't check your email. Don't check your email for 2 weeks. How about that? Don't just get rid of all of those inputs that are frankly junk food for your life, right? And then I would say you got to get away, different place, change your pace, go on really long walks, several-hour walks, and arm yourself with reflective questions that are going to help you have a sabbatical mindset. Questions like, what has God been teaching me in my life this past year? Questions like, what am I doing that is wearing me out? What kind of season does God have me in? Is there anything that I need to say no to? These questions that really are the difference between you being restful or not, and giving yourself space for it. And then this image was given to me by a professor. I think he got it from a really good book. I think it's called Invitation to Silence. Ruth Haley Barton. I actually highly recommend that book. And she gives this metaphor of taking water from a river, putting water from a river. River's running along. And if you take water from a river in a glass and you put it on a counter and you let it just sit, it looks kind of murky, but if you let the water sit for about 20, 30, 50 minutes, the murkiness becomes clear and all the sediment goes to the bottom. And I think treating a sabbatical, a 2-week time where you slow down your life, you let all the murkiness of your life, the emails, the text messages, the social media, all that stuff, let it settle, and you'll just see the things God has for you a lot more clearly. So I think take a sabbatical, audience. Take a 2-week sabbatical. Don't take a vacation. Take a sabbatical. I wonder how it would impact you. Man, I want to go take a sabbatical right now after this conversation. Well, thanks for joining us on this episode of Jesus On, and we hope and pray that it gives you